Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The Bitter Frost and the Bold Interloper. The fog came rolling into Lochdoub like an uninvited guest, thick and damp and determined to settle in for a good long stay. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of his kitchen, watching the grey mist swallow the last glimpse of the loch, and permitted himself a small smile of satisfaction. Weather like this meant folk would stay indoors, which meant no petty crimes to investigate, no domestic disputes to mediate, and no reason whatsoever for anyone to expect him to do anything more strenuous than feed his animals, and perhaps make himself a proper breakfast. Hamish was a tall, gangly man with hazel eyes and red hair that refused to lie flat no matter how much water he applied to it. He had the sort of face that inspired trust in little old ladies and mild contempt in his superiors at Strathbane, who considered him hopelessly lazy and utterly lacking in ambition. This assessment was entirely accurate, and Hamish worked very hard to maintain his reputation for idleness. The last thing he wanted was a promotion that would drag him away from his beloved village and deposit him in some dreary office where he would be expected to wear a proper uniform and keep regular hours. "Come along, then." "Lugs," he said to the dog lying by the stove. "Let us see to the sheep before this fog gets any thicker." Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed with large floppy ears that gave him a permanently mournful expression, thumped his tail twice against the floor but made no move to rise. He had inherited his master's views on unnecessary exertion. "Aye, will suit yourself," said Hamish, "but don't come whining to me when Sunsy gets your breakfast." At the mention of the wild cat's name, Lugs reluctantly hauled himself to his feet. Sonsy, who was curled up in an armchair that she had claimed as her own, opened one golden eye and regarded them both with feline disdain before returning to her nap. Hamish pulled on his Wellingtons and an ancient wax jacket that had seen better days, collected a bucket of feed and headed out into the fog. His small flock of sheep materialised from the mist like woolly ghosts bleating their demands. He scattered the feed and counted heads, more from habit than concern. Nothing much disturbed the peace in Lochdoub, which was precisely how he liked it. He was making his way back to the station when he heard the sound of a car engine, loud and aggressive in the muffled quiet of the fog. A moment later a sleek black Mercedes emerged from the grey curtain, driving far too fast for the narrow road and the poor visibility. It slowed as it passed him, and Hamish caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and an expensive suit, regarding the village through the windscreen with an expression that suggested he had just discovered something unpleasant on his shoe. "Tourist," muttered Hamish, and thought no more about it. But by late afternoon, when he made his customary visit to the Lochdoub Hotel for a cup of tea, he discovered that the tourist was rather more than that. The bar was buzzing with an energy that Hamish recognised immediately as trouble. The villagers were clustered in tight groups, their voices low and angry, and at the centre of the storm sat the man from the Mercedes, nursing a whisky and radiating smug superiority. "That's him!" hissed Archie McLean, the local fisherman, grabbing Hamish's arm as he entered. "That's the bastard who says half the village is living on land they've no right to." "Is that so?" said Hamish mildly, accepting a cup of tea from the bartender. "And who might he be when he's at home?" "Julian Vane," spat Archie, making the name sound like a curse. "Corporate auditor from London." "If you please. Says he's been hired to verify the land deeds for some property development scheme. Came in here bold as brass, telling us that most of the titles in Lochdoub are worthless, that our families have been squatting on land we never properly owned." Hamish sipped his tea and studied Julian Vane over the rim of his cup. The man was holding court now, his voice carrying clearly across the bar. "I'm simply doing my job," Vane was saying, in the sort of accent that suggested he had never done a day's manual labour in his life. If your ancestors were too ignorant or too lazy to properly register their claims, well, that's hardly my fault, is it? The law is quite clear on these matters." "The law," said Dr. Brodie, his normally genial face flushed with anger, "is an ass when it allows the likes of you to come up here and threaten decent people." Vane smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Threaten? Dear me, Doctor, I'm merely informing you of the facts, though I must say it's fascinating what one discovers when one digs into the past. All sorts of little secrets come to light, some of them quite professionally relevant, I should think." The doctor went pale and Hamish's eyes narrowed slightly. There was more here than the simple property disputes. Vane was enjoying himself far too much for this to be purely business. The door opened, letting in a fresh swirl of fog and a small, round woman carrying a wicker basket. Mrs. Morag Ross, the village librarian, paused on the threshold, taking in the tense atmosphere with quick, bright eyes. "Oh my," she said softly. "What's all this, then?" Her gentle voice seemed to break the spell. The villagers turned to her like flowers to the sun, and Hamish saw the tension ease slightly. Morag had that effect on people. She was the sort of woman who brought out the protective instincts in men and the maternal confidences in women. Always ready with a kind word, a cup of tea, and a listening ear. "Just a bit of unpleasantness, Mrs. Ross," said Hamish, moving to help her with her basket. "Nothing to concern yourself with." "Well, unpleasantness or no, you all look like you could use some sustenance," she said, setting the basket on the bar. "I've just done some baking, and these scones will go stale if someone doesn't eat them." She began distributing scones with maternal efficiency, and the mood in the bar softened perceptibly. Even Julian Vane, Hamish noticed, accepted a scone with a curt nod, though he made no move to thank her properly. As the crowd began to disperse, mollified by Morag's gentle intervention, she turned to Hamish with a smile. "I've set aside a few for you, Constable," she said, producing a small cloth-wrapped bundle from her basket. "I know how you like your tea and scones of an evening." "You're very kind, Mrs. Ross," said Hamish, accepting the bundle with genuine pleasure. Morag made the best scones in the village, light as air and still warm from the oven. "Not at all," she said, patting his arm. "We must all look after each other, mustn't we? Especially in times like these." She glanced toward Julian Vane, who was draining his whisky glass and preparing to leave. "Such a difficult man," she murmured. "I do hope he won't cause too much trouble before he moves on." But as Hamish walked back through the fog to his police station, lugs trotting at his heels and the scones growing cold in his pocket, he had the distinct feeling that trouble was exactly what Julian Vane intended to cause. And in a village as small and as tightly knit as Lochdew, trouble had a way of spreading like wildfire, no matter how thick the fog. He fed lugs and Sonsy, made himself a pot of tea, and settled into his favourite chair with one of Morag's excellent scones. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in the village, Julian Vane was no doubt making his plans to upend the lives of honest folk who had never done him any harm. Hamish sighed and reached for another scone. Tomorrow, he suspected, was going to be a very trying day indeed. Chapter 2. Death at the Sacred Boundary. The telephone jangled Hamish awake at 6:30 in the morning, a time he considered uncivilized for any communication that didn't involve actual bloodshed or fire. He fumbled for the receiver, dislodging Sonsy from her position on his chest, and mumbled something that might have been interpreted as a greeting by someone with a charitable disposition. "Hamish, you'd best get yourself down to the churchyard right quick." It was Angus MacDonald, the village seer, his voice crackling with excitement. "There's been a death." Hamish sat up, suddenly awake. "Who?" "That Vane fellow. The one from London. Found him myself not 10 minutes ago when I was taking my morning constitutional. Have you called Strathbane?" There was a pause. "I called you first, didn't I?" "Thought you'd want to see things before that fat fool Blair comes trampling all over everything." Hamish was already pulling on his clothes. "Don't touch anything, Angus, and don't let anyone else near the body. I'll be there directly." The fog had lifted during the night, leaving the morning air sharp and clear and cold enough to freeze the breath in your lungs. Hamish hurried down the main street, lugs loping beside him, his mind already working through the possibilities. A man like Julian Vane, who had spent his evening making enemies with spectacular efficiency, had probably met with an accident, or perhaps his heart had given out. Rich men from London weren't built for Highland winters. But when he reached the churchyard and saw the body slumped against the ancient stone wall, he knew immediately that this was no accident. Julian Vane sat with his back to the wall, his legs sprawled out before him, his expensive suit jacket dark with morning dew. His head lolled at an unnatural angle, and even from several feet away Hamish could see the depressed fracture in the skull, the matted blood in the slicked back hair. Lying beside him, half buried in the disturbed earth, was a heavy cast-iron implement, its surface stained with blood and what looked like strands of hair. "Mother of God," breathed Hamish. "Aye," said Angus, who was standing a respectful distance away, his lined face pale in the morning light. "That's the old peat cutter from the heritage display in the library. Must weigh a good 20 pounds or more." Hamish crouched down, careful not to disturb the scene, and studied the weapon. It was indeed the antique peat cutter, a brutal-looking tool with a narrow blade designed for slicing through compressed peat. He'd seen it dozens of times, gathering dust in its glass case in the village library alongside other implements of bygone Highland life. But it was the ground around the body that caught his attention and sent a chill down his spine. The earth at the base of the wall had been disturbed, not by the scuffle of a fight, but by deliberate digging. Fresh scrape marks scarred the ancient stones, and scattered about were several loose rocks that had clearly been pried from the wall's foundation. "He was looking for something," said Hamish quietly. "Aye, that's what I thought myself," said Angus. "Looks like he was digging at the wall when someone came up behind him and clocked him with that iron." Hamish stood and began walking the perimeter of the scene. It was his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The frost on the grass was trampled in several places, showing where the killer had approached and then departed. Large boot prints, the kind left by Wellington boots, led away from the body toward the road. "I'll need to call Strathbane," said Hamish with a sigh. "You'd best go home, Angus. They'll want statements from everyone." Angus nodded and shuffled off, muttering something about death omens and ill winds, leaving Hamish alone with the body and his thoughts. He made the call from his mobile, spoke briefly with the duty sergeant, and then settled in to wait for the inevitable arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He didn't have to wait long. Within 40 minutes the churchyard was swarming with police vehicles, and Blair himself came puffing up the path like an overweight walrus in an ill-fitting suit. "Well, well, well," Blair wheezed, his red face gleaming with satisfaction. "Looks like your quiet wee village has gone and got itself a proper murder, Macbeth. Stand aside and let the real detectives handle this." Hamish stood aside with alacrity. The less he appeared to be involved, the better. Blair had hated him ever since Hamish had solved a series of cases that had made the Detective Chief Inspector look incompetent, which was easy enough to do given that Blair was spectacularly incompetent. Blair circled the body like a predator, his small eyes darting about, no doubt searching for something he could claim credit for discovering. Behind him came Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, Blair's long-suffering second-in-command, who caught Hamish's eye and gave a small sympathetic shrug. "Right then," said Blair, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "This is clearly the work of one of your locals, Macbeth. Man comes up from London, starts nosing about in people's business, and someone decides to shut him up permanent-like. Simple as that." "Perhaps," said Hamish mildly. "Though you might want to have forensics look at those boot prints before you go trampling all over them." Blair glared at him. "I know how to conduct a murder investigation, thank you very much. You just stick to giving out parking tickets and leave the real police work to professionals." The forensics team arrived, and Hamish retreated to a respectful distance, watching as they photographed the scene, bagged the murder weapon, and made plaster casts of the boot prints. Blair strutted about, issuing orders and generally getting in everyone's way. It was nearly noon before they finished with the preliminary examination and had the body removed. Hamish was preparing to head back to the station when a small figure appeared at his elbow. "Oh, Constable Macbeth," said Mrs. Morag Ross, her round face creased with concern. "Is it true? Is Mr. Vane really dead?" "I'm afraid so, Mrs. Ross." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "How terrible! How perfectly terrible! I know he wasn't a pleasant man, but to die like this so far from home." "Did you know him well?" asked Hamish, watching her carefully. "Oh no, not at all. I only met him yesterday when he came into the library looking for the land registry records. He was quite rude, actually, very demanding. But still, one wouldn't wish this on anyone." She pulled a thermos flask from her shopping bag. "I've brought some coffee for those poor detectives from Strathbane. They must be frozen through, and I thought you might like some yourself." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Ross," said Hamish, accepting a cup of steaming coffee gratefully. The morning had indeed been cold, and he'd been standing about in the frost for hours. Morag poured coffee for the Strathbane officers, with the same gentle efficiency she'd shown the previous evening, and Blair, despite his earlier bluster, accepted a cup with something approaching civility. "Mrs. Ross," said Blair, puffing out his chest importantly, "I understand you work at the village library. That murder weapon came from there, did it not?" "Oh yes," said Morag, her eyes wide. "The old peat cutter from the heritage display. I can't imagine how it got here. The display case was locked when I closed up yesterday evening." "Was it indeed?" Blair pulled out a notebook. "And who has keys to this display?" "Only myself and Mr. Ferguson, the head librarian. But he's been away in Inverness visiting his daughter for the past week." "So only you had access to the weapon," said Blair with heavy significance. Morag paled. "Surely you don't think... I mean, I would never... Oh, this is terrible." Now, said Hamish quickly. "No one's accusing you of anything, Mrs. Ross. The Detective Chief Inspector is just gathering information." Blair shot him a poisonous look, but before he could speak, Morag reached into her bag again. "I've made a list," she said, producing a neatly typed sheet of paper. "When I heard about poor Mr. Vane, I thought it might be helpful. It's everyone he threatened or insulted at the hotel yesterday evening. I happened to overhear quite a bit while I was distributing the scones." Blair snatched the list and scanned it eagerly. His face lit up with the expression of a hound catching a scent. "Excellent work, Mrs. Ross. This will save us considerable time. Mark my words, the killer's name is on this list, and I'll have them in custody before the day is out." He marched off, shouting for Anderson, leaving Hamish and Morag standing by the churchyard wall. "I do hope I've done the right thing," said Morag quietly. "I wouldn't want to get anyone in trouble unfairly." "I'm sure it will all come out in the wash," said Hamish, though privately he doubted that very much. This Blair had all the investigative subtlety of a bull in a china shop, and innocent people were likely to get hurt before this was over. Morag gave him a grateful smile and headed back toward the village. Her small figure hunched against the cold. Hamish watched her go, then turned back to survey the crime scene one last time. The ancient churchyard wall stood silent and implacable, its stones holding whatever secrets Julian Vane had died trying to uncover. And somewhere in Lochdubh, a killer was going about their business, no doubt hoping that Blair's incompetence would be enough to keep them safe. Hamish sighed and started back toward the police station. It was going to be a long investigation, and he had a feeling that before it was over, a great many uncomfortable truths were going to come to light. Chapter 3: Sifting the Highland Gossip. By mid-afternoon, Blair had established himself in the local hotel's small function room, like a conquering general planning his campaign. Hamish, knowing that the Detective Chief Inspector would target the innocent with gleeful abandon if left to his own devices, decided that a quiet investigation of his own was not merely advisable but necessary. His first stop was the Curry sisters' cottage, a neat little house with lace curtains that twitched whenever anyone passed by. Nessie and Jessie Curry were twin spinsters who served as the village's unofficial intelligence network, though they would have been mortally offended by such a description. They preferred to think of themselves as concerned citizens with a keen interest in community welfare. Nessie opened the door at his knock, her sharp eyes brightening with interest. "Hamish Macbeth! Come in, come in. We were just saying, weren't we, Jessie, that you'd be round to see us before long." "Before long," echoed Jessie, appearing behind her sister like a mirror image. "Terrible business about that London man." "Terrible business," confirmed Nessie, ushering him into their sitting room, which was so crammed with china ornaments and embroidered cushions that Hamish had to navigate carefully to avoid causing a catastrophe. "I was hoping you ladies might have noticed something yesterday," said Hamish, accepting a cup of tea that appeared as if by magic. "Being observant as you are." The sisters exchanged meaningful glances. "Well," said Nessie, leaning forward conspiratorially, "we did see Mr. Vane having words with a young man down by the harbour yesterday afternoon. Quite heated it was." "Quite heated," agreed Jessie. "The young man was waving his arms about something terrible." "Could you describe this young man?" 30-ish, I'd say," offered Nessie. "Dark hair, expensive-looking coat. Not from around here, that's for certain." "Not from around here," Jessie confirmed. "City clothes. Edinburgh, I'd wager, from the way he carried himself." Hamish made a note of this. "What time would this have been?" 3:30, said Nessie promptly. "We were just coming back from our walk when we saw them." "Just coming back," said Jessie. "And did you hear what they were arguing about?" The sisters looked disappointed. "Too far away for that," admitted Nessie. "But the young man looked angry enough to spit." "Angry enough to spit," Jessie confirmed with relish. Hamish finished his tea and made his escape before they could offer him cake, which would have extended the visit by another half-hour at minimum. His next destination was Angus MacDonald's caravan, perched on a hill overlooking the loch. Angus was sitting outside despite the cold, smoking his pipe and gazing out at the water with the faraway look he adopted when he wanted people to think he was having visions. Hamish knew better. The old fraud was about as psychic as lugs, but he had an uncanny ability to collect information through his extensive network of gossipy relatives and friends scattered across the Highlands. "Angus," said Hamish, settling himself on an upturned crate. "What have you heard?" The old man's eyes sharpened immediately, the mystic pose abandoned. "About the murder? Plenty. Blair's been stamping about like a bull with a sore head, threatening to arrest half the village." "Aye, well, that's Blair's way. But I'm more interested in what you know about Julian Vane." Angus puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. "Heard he was asking questions at the county records office in Strathbane 2 days ago. Very interested in property deeds from the 1950s, according to my cousin who works there. Specifically, land around the old churchyard." "The 50s? Hamish's interest sharpened. "That's oddly specific." "Aye, and there's more. My nephew, who drives a taxi in Edinburgh, picked up a fare 3 days back. Young fellow asking about Loch Dubh and the Vane family. Said he was Julian Vane's nephew. Come north to see his uncle." "Did he now?" Hamish pulled out his notebook. "You wouldn't happen to know this nephew's name?" "Callum Vane. And according to my nephew, he seemed quite desperate to find his uncle. Something about debts and inheritance." Hamish filed this away with satisfaction. The mysterious young man the Curry sisters had seen arguing with Vane was almost certainly this nephew. "You're a credit to the site, Angus," the old man cackled. "Oh, away with you. Nothing supernatural about keeping your ears open and your mouth shut at the right times." As evening drew in, Hamish made his way to the Loch Dubh Hotel, where he knew he would find Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson. Jimmy was Blair's opposite in every way that mattered. Competent, amiable, and possessed of a functioning brain. He was also fond of whiskey, which made him susceptible to Hamish's particular brand of persuasion. He found Jimmy in the bar, looking harassed and in desperate need of a drink. Hamish ordered 2 generous measures of Glenfiddich and slid one across to the detective. "You're a saint, Hamish," said Jimmy, taking a grateful sip. "Blair's been on the rampage all day. He's convinced he's going to crack this case before supper and make the evening news." "Is that so? And who's his prime suspect?" "Archie McLean, the fisherman." Forensics matched the boot prints at the scene to a pair of Wellingtons they found in Archie's shed. "Blair's over the moon about it." Hamish's heart sank. "And has anyone bothered to check if half the men in Loch Dubh own identical Wellingtons from the same shop in Strathbane? Not Blair's style, is it? He likes his cases simple and his rests fast." Jimmy lowered his voice. Between you and me, I'm not convinced. The whole thing feels too neat, and Archie doesn't strike me as the murdering type." "No, he's not," agreed Hamish. "Too fond of his whiskey and too scared of his wife to risk a life sentence. Still, those boot prints are solid evidence, and Blair's determined to make an arrest tomorrow morning." Jimmy finished his whiskey and sighed. "You wouldn't happen to have seen the autopsy report, would you?" "Me? Why would I have access to official police documents?" Hamish's expression was the picture of innocence. Jimmy grinned and slid a folder across the table. "That's what I thought. Have a quick look while I visit the gents, and for God's sake don't let Blair catch you with it." Hamish read quickly while Jimmy was gone. The autopsy confirmed what he'd already suspected. Single blow to the back of the skull, delivered with considerable force by someone standing behind and slightly to the left of the victim. Time of death estimated between 10 o'clock and midnight. No defensive wounds, suggesting Vane had been taken completely by surprise. When Jimmy returned, Hamish had the folder back on the table, but the information was filed away in his head. "You'll be wanting another dram before you face Blair again." "You're reading my mind, Hamish, though I'd need the whole bottle to make that bearable." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the locals come and go. Then Hamish asked casually, "Has anyone looked into Vane's background yet? What he was really doing up here?" "Blair says it doesn't matter. Says it's a straightforward case of a local taking offence and lashing out. But if you're asking what I think," Jimmy leaned closer. "I had a quick look at his laptop before Blair locked it away as evidence. Vane kept detailed files on everyone he investigated. Not just property records, but financial information, personal history, the works. The man was a professional blackmailer, Hamish. No question about it." "Blackmail," repeated Hamish softly. "Now that opens up a world of possibilities, doesn't it?" "Aye, it does. But try telling Blair that." Jimmy stood reluctantly. "I'd best get back before he sends out a search party. Thanks for the whiskey, Hamish. And if you happen to solve this case before we do, try to make it look like Blair did all the work, would you? It'll save us all a lot of grief." After Jimmy left, Hamish sat nursing his own drink and thinking. A blackmailer killed with a weapon from the library, boot prints that could belong to half the village, and a nephew from Edinburgh with debts and inheritance on his mind. Plus whatever secrets were buried beneath that churchyard wall. It was a proper tangle, and Blair was about to make it worse by arresting the wrong man. Hamish sighed and finished his whiskey. Tomorrow he would need to start pulling on threads and seeing what unravelled. But tonight he would go home to his animals and his warm kitchen and try not to think about how many lives were about to be torn apart before this was over. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. Hamish woke the next morning to find Sonsi sitting on his chest, staring at him with unblinking golden eyes that suggested she found his continued existence mildly disappointing. He shifted her gently aside and checked his mobile phone. 3 missed calls from Jimmy Anderson, all before 7 o'clock. That was never a good sign. He rang back while making coffee, and Jimmy answered on the first ring. "Hamish, thank God. The autopsy results are back with more detail. Dr. Forsyth confirmed it was a single blow, delivered with precision. Whoever killed Vane knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. This wasn't some clumsy brawl that went wrong. Premeditated, then. Very much so. And there's something else. They found traces of what looks like archival glue on Vane's jacket sleeve. The kind used for preserving old documents." Hamish's mind began working through the implications. "From the library, perhaps?" "That's what I thought. But Blair's not interested. He's got his boot prints and his suspect, and that's all he needs. He's going to arrest Archie this morning." After he rang off, Hamish stood at his kitchen window, watching the early morning light spread across the loch. An idea was forming. Dangerous but necessary. If Blair was going to charge ahead like a runaway train, someone needed to do the actual detective work. The village library didn't open until 9, but Hamish knew where the spare key was hidden. Mrs. Ross had mentioned it once in passing, tucked under a loose stone by the back door for emergencies. Breaking and entering wasn't exactly his style, but then again, neither was letting an innocent man go to prison. Lugs whined softly as Hamish pulled on his jacket. I know, but sometimes a man must do what a man must do, even if it's technically illegal. The library was a small stone building that had once been a schoolhouse, its shelves crammed with an eclectic mix of popular novels, local history volumes, and agricultural manuals. The heritage display occupied one corner, a collection of old farm implements and household items behind glass. The peat cutter's absence was obvious, leaving an empty bracket on the wall where it had hung. Hamish moved through the building methodically, his trained eyes searching for anything that might connect to the murder. The main reading room yielded nothing unusual, nor did the small kitchen where Mrs. Ross made tea for the library volunteers. It was in the archives room, a cramped space lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes, that he found it. The wall safe was hidden behind a reproduction print of a Highland landscape, and it wasn't particularly well concealed. The frame sat slightly askew, as if someone had opened it recently and not quite managed to hang it properly again. Hamish lifted the picture down and studied the safe. It was old, the kind with a simple combination lock that relied more on secrecy than security. He tried several obvious combinations without success, then sat back on his heels and thought about what he knew of Julian Vane. The man had been arrogant, thorough, and obsessed with property records from the 1950s. On impulse, Hamish tried 1950. The lock clicked open. Inside was a black leather ledger, its cover worn smooth with handling. Hamish pulled it out carefully and opened it to the first page. What he found there made his blood run cold. It was a meticulous record of blackmail, pure and simple. Each entry detailed a person's name, their secret, and the amount Vane had extracted from them. The sums varied wildly, from a few £100s to several thousand, depending on what the victim could afford and how desperately they wanted their secret kept. Hamish scanned the entries, his anger growing with each page. There was Archie McLean being squeezed for £200 a month to keep his wife from learning about a savings account he'd hidden away. Dr. Brodie paying £500 to prevent disclosure of a medical error from his early career. Even the Reverend Wellington appeared, though the nature of his indiscretion was coded in a way Hamish couldn't immediately decipher. But it was the final entry that stopped him cold. The page was dated 3 days before the murder, and the handwriting was different from the rest, shakier and less controlled. It wasn't a financial transaction, but a note, apparently written by Vane himself. Ross family theft, 1958. Items buried beneath Churchyard wall, east corner. Father's suicide following bankruptcy fraud by V Senior. Daughter still in village, identity concealed, leverage potential, unlimited. Hamish read it twice, his mind racing. Vane hadn't just been blackmailing people over their own secrets. He'd been digging into their family histories, unearthing old tragedies and using them as weapons. He photographed every page of the ledger with his mobile phone, then carefully replaced it in the safe and rehung the picture. As he was leaving through the back door, he nearly collided with Mrs. Morag Ross herself, arriving with her key in hand. "Oh, Constable Macbeth!" She pressed a hand to her chest. "You gave me quite a start. Whatever are you doing here so early?" Hamish's mind worked frantically. "Just making sure everything was secure, Mrs. Ross. After the murder weapon came from here, you understand. Can't be too careful." "Oh, how thoughtful of you." Her smile was warm and grateful. "I've been so worried about the library's security. It's terrible to think someone broke in and stole the peat cutter." "About that," said Hamish carefully. "Have you noticed any signs of forced entry? Broken locks, damaged windows?" Morag frowned thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, no. Yeah, I assumed they must have picked the lock somehow, but everything looked perfectly normal when I opened up the day after it happened. And the display case itself? It locks with a small key. I keep it on my keyring." She pulled out a substantial ring of keys from her handbag. "See? All present and accounted for." Hamish examined the keys, noting that one was significantly shinier than the others, as if it had been recently cut. "You've not lost any of these recently, or had duplicates made?" "Oh no, I'm very careful with them. Though, She paused, looking troubled. Mr. Vane did ask to borrow my keys when he was researching in the archives 2 days before he died. He said he wanted to photograph some documents and needed to lock up properly when he was finished. I didn't see the harm in it at the time. And how long did he have them? Only about an hour. He brought them back to my desk when he was done. An hour, thought Hamish. Plenty of time to pop into the village shop, have a duplicate made of the display case key, and return the originals with no one the wiser. Mrs. Ross. Did Mr. Vane seem particularly interested in any specific period of local history? Well, yes, actually. He was quite focused on property transactions from the late 1950s. Kept asking about families who'd left the area suddenly, businesses that had failed, that sort of thing. She shook her head sadly. He wasn't a pleasant man, but he was certainly thorough in his research. I don't suppose you remember which specific families he was researching? Morag's expression became guarded. I'm afraid I don't recall the details. There were so many names, and I was quite busy with other patrons that day. It was smoothly done, but Hamish caught the slight hesitation before she answered. Mrs. Ross, for all her gentle demeanour, was lying. Well, I'll let you get on with your day, said Hamish, tipping his cap to her. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Ross. As he walked back to the police station, his mind was churning. The ledger proved that Vane had been blackmailing half the village, which meant half the village had a motive for murder. But the reference to the Ross family and the buried items beneath the churchyard wall suggested something more personal, more deeply rooted in the past. He needed to dig into the history of Lochdoub in the 1950s, and he needed to do it before Blair arrested Archie and closed the case. Back at the station, he found a note pushed through his letterbox. It was from Jimmy Anderson. Blair making arrest at noon. Sorry. The autopsy photos are in the evidence room if you want to look. Key under the flower pot outside the hotel function room. Burn this note. Hamish burned the note in his kitchen sink and checked his watch. He had 3 hours to find something that would stop Blair from making a catastrophic mistake. 3 hours to uncover secrets that had been buried for nearly 70 years. He set a pot of coffee brewing and opened his laptop. It was time to do some digging of his own. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. Hamish spent the next 2 hours hunched over his laptop, working his way through digitised records from the Highland Council archives. What he found painted a picture both tragic and familiar, the old story of greed destroying lives. In 1958, a small engineering firm called Ross and McLeod had been driven into bankruptcy by a competitor who'd used questionable accounting practices to undercut their contracts. The competitor's name was Victor Vane, Julian's father. Robert Ross, the senior partner, had taken his own life 3 months after the bankruptcy was finalised. His widow and young daughter had left Lochdoub shortly afterward, destination unknown, or perhaps not so unknown after all. Hamish pulled up a photograph from the archived newspaper coverage of the bankruptcy trial. The grainy image showed Robert Ross standing outside the courthouse, his face haggard with strain. Beside him stood his wife, clutching the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The girl's face was turned away from the camera, but something about the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself, niggled at Hamish's memory. He was still staring at the photograph when someone hammered on his door. It was Blair, red-faced and triumphant, with 2 constables flanking him. Right then, Macbeth. I'm here to make my arrest, and I'll thank you to stay out of the way while I do proper police work. You're arresting Archie McLean. I am indeed. The evidence is conclusive. Boot prints match his Wellingtons. He had motive after Vane threatened to expose his hidden money. And he has no alibi for the time of death, Blair puffed out his chest. This case is closed. And what about the archival glue on Vane's jacket? The fact that someone with knowledge of the library stole the murder weapon? The blackmail ledger hidden in the library safe? Blair's eyes narrowed dangerously. What blackmail ledger? Hamish cursed himself silently. He'd let his tongue run away with him. Just speculation based on what Vane was doing in the village. A man doesn't threaten half the locals without keeping records. Speculation is all it is then. I deal in facts, Macbeth. Hard evidence. which is why I'm making an arrest and you're sitting here playing with your computer like a schoolboy." Blair turned to his constables. "Come on, lads, let's go collect our murderer." After they left, Hamish sat for a long moment, weighing his options. He could follow Blair and try to intervene, but that would only make things worse. The Detective Chief Inspector was like a dog with a bone when it came to arrests. Once he'd committed, nothing short of divine intervention would stop him. Instead, Hamish grabbed his jacket and headed for Dr. Brodie's surgery. He found the doctor in his office, looking considerably more haggard than usual. A bottle of whiskey sat on the desk, and the doctor's hands trembled slightly as he poured a measure into a teacup. "Hamish!" Brodie didn't sound surprised to see him. "I suppose you've come about the blackmail. You knew about Vane's ledger then?" "I suspected. The man had information no honest auditor should possess." The doctor took a sip of whiskey. "He knew about a mistake I made 20 years ago, early in my career. A misdiagnosis that delayed treatment for a patient. They survived, thank God, but it could have gone very badly. Vane threatened to report it to the medical board unless I paid him monthly instalments. How much? £500, not enough to bankrupt me, but enough to hurt. The clever bastard knew exactly how to pitch it, didn't he? Just painful enough to pay, but not so much that you'd risk refusing." "Where were you the night he died, Doctor?" Brodie met his eyes steadily. "Playing cards with Reverend Wellington until midnight. We do it every Tuesday. The Reverend will confirm it, though I suspect he'd rather not mention that we play for money." Hamish made a note. "And you didn't leave at all during the evening?" "Not once. Mrs. Wellington brought us tea at 10:30, and we were still at the table when the clock struck 12. He paused. "I won't pretend I'm sorry Vane's dead, Hamish. The world's better off without him, but I didn't kill him." From the surgery, Hamish made his way to the harbour, where he found Archie McLean's boat tied up at the pier. Archie's wife, a formidable woman built like a Sherman tank, was standing on the dock shouting at Blair's constables as they led her husband away in handcuffs. "You've got the wrong man, you fools! My Archie wouldn't hurt a fly, even when the fly deserves hurting." Hamish waited until the police car had driven away before approaching her. "Mrs. McLean, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about that night." She turned on him, eyes blazing. "You want to know if my husband's a murderer? He's not. He's a coward and a drunk, and he's been hiding money from me for 15 years, but he's no killer. The money Vane knew about. Aye, his precious whiskey fund. Did he think I didn't know about it? I've known for years. Let him have his little secrets, I thought. Keeps him happy." She wiped her eyes roughly. "And now that English bastard's dead, and my Archie's going to prison for it." "Where was Archie that night, Mrs. McLean?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Hiding in the pub cellar. The Drummonds let him sleep it off down there sometimes when he's had too much and doesn't want to face me. He was there from 9 o'clock until morning. Half the pub saw him go down, and he didn't come up until the bartender woke him at 7. Another alibi, thought Hamish. If the Drummonds confirmed it, that put Archie in the clear. His mobile rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, speaking quickly and quietly. "Hamish, we've got a new player. Callum Vane, Julian's nephew from Edinburgh, just walked into the station demanding to know when he can collect his inheritance. Blair's interviewing him now. I'll be right there." Hamish arrived at the hotel function room to find a young man in an expensive but rumpled suit, arguing loudly with Blair. Callum Vane had his uncle's arrogance, but none of the Polish. He looked like what he was, a desperate gambler in over his head. "I have every right to know about my uncle's estate," Callum was saying. "I'm his only living relative." "You're also a suspect in his murder," Blair shot back. "When did you arrive in Lochdoub?" "I didn't arrive in Lochdoub. I came to Strathbane 3 days ago to meet with Uncle Julian. But he refused to see me, said I'd wasted enough of the family money and he wasn't giving me another penny. So you followed him here and killed him." "I did not follow him anywhere. I went back to Edinburgh that same day. I can prove it. My car went through the traffic cameras on the A9 at 8 o'clock that evening. It's a 4-hour drive from here. There's no way I could have been in Lochdoub when he was killed." Blair looked disappointed, but not defeated. "We'll check your alibi. In the meantime, where were you staying in Edinburgh? The Balmoral Hotel. I have receipts. I had dinner there at 11 o'clock, and the staff will remember me because I made rather a scene when they told me the kitchen was closing. After Callum left, escorted by a constable to provide his formal statement, Hamish caught Jimmy's eye. "What do you think?" asked Jimmy quietly. "I think his alibi will check out, and I think Blair's arrested the wrong man." Hamish rubbed his eyes tiredly. "This case isn't about money or property disputes, Jimmy. It's about something older and deeper, something to do with the past." "What past?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Hamish checked his watch. "I need to speak to Reverend Wellington. If the doctor's alibi holds, that's 3 suspects eliminated, which means we're looking in the wrong direction entirely." The church was dim and peaceful, smelling of old stone and furniture polish. Reverend Wellington was arranging hymn books when Hamish entered, and his face lit up with pleasure. "Hamish, come to seek spiritual guidance on this terrible business?" "More like temporal confirmation, Reverend. I need to verify, Doctor." "Brodie's alibi for the night of the murder." The Reverend's smile faded. "I see. Yes, the doctor was with me from 7 o'clock until midnight. We were playing poker in my study. My wife can confirm it, though she doesn't approve of gambling." He paused. "Dr. Brodie didn't kill anyone, Hamish. I'd stake my collar on it." 3 solid alibis, thought Hamish, as he walked back through the village. Archie in the pub cellar, the doctor playing cards, and Callum Vane miles away in Edinburgh, which left him with a widening pool of suspects and a narrowing window of time. Someone in Lochdoub had killed Julian Vane with cold precision and considerable planning. Someone who knew the library, knew the village, and had a reason buried 70 years deep. And Hamish was beginning to suspect he knew exactly who that someone was. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. The following evening found Hamish once again at the churchyard, this time in the company of Lugs, who was investigating the base of the wall with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd caught an interesting scent. The forensics team had finished their work and removed their tape, leaving behind only the disturbed earth and the lingering sense of violence. Hamish crouched down, examining the scratches on the stones by torchlight. Someone had been digging here with purpose, prying at the mortar between the stones as if searching for something specific. According to Vane's ledger entry, there were items buried beneath this wall, hidden there by Robert Ross in 1958 to keep them from his creditors. What items? And why would Vane's discovery of them be worth killing for? He was so absorbed in his examination that he didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost upon him. Hamish straightened quickly, his hand moving to his torch, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. A figure emerged from the shadows carrying what looked like a large sack. In the dim light, Hamish recognised the portly shape of Dr. Brodie. "Doctor," said Hamish quietly, "bit late for a constitutional, isn't it?" Brodie froze, the sack clutched to his chest. "Hamish, I was just taking a walk with a rather heavy burden by the looks of it." Hamish moved closer, and Lugs, sensing the tension, growled softly. "What's in the sack, Doctor?" Brodie's shoulders sagged. "You'll think me a complete fool. I've thought that about most people at one time or another. Show me." With visible reluctance, Brodie set the sack on the ground and opened it. Inside, wrapped in burlap, was a salmon, a magnificent fish that must have weighed 15 pounds. Its scales gleamed in the torchlight, and even in death, it had the sleek beauty of a creature perfectly designed for its element. "You've been poaching," said Hamish, not quite managing to keep the amusement from his voice. "Just the once. Well, perhaps twice. All right, it's been a regular Tuesday occurrence, but I swear on my medical degree this is the last time." Brodie looked thoroughly miserable. "My wife's been after me about our grocery bills, saying we need to economise. I thought if I could catch a fish now and then, it would help. But then this business with the murder happened, and I panicked. I couldn't very well keep evidence of poaching in my freezer when the police might search my house. So you were planning to bury it here, in the churchyard? The ground's already disturbed from where Vane was digging. I thought, Well, I wasn't thinking clearly, was I? But you must see Hamish. If this got out between the medical board investigation Vane was threatening and a poaching charge, I'd be ruined. Hamish considered the doctor, who stood there looking rather like a schoolboy caught stealing apples. It was true that technically poaching was illegal, and technically Hamish should report it. But it was also true that half the men in Lochdoub had taken a salmon from the river at some point in their lives, and that the letter of the law didn't always serve the spirit of Highland justice. "Here's what's going to happen," said Hamish finally. "You're going to take that fish home. Tell your wife you bought it from Archie McLean before his arrest, and you're never going to mention this little midnight excursion to anyone. And in return, I'm going to forget I ever saw you here." Relief flooded Brodie's face. "You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth." "I'm a lazy man who doesn't want to fill out poaching reports at midnight. There's a difference." Hamish softened his tone. "Go on home, Doctor, and next time you're feeling the pinch financially, try the chip shop. Less illegal, fewer bones." After Brodie hurried away, clutching his contraband salmon, Hamish sat on the churchyard wall and thought about what he'd learned. The doctor's alibi had been solid, and now Hamish had caught him doing something foolish but entirely unrelated to murder. That eliminated another suspect from his list, which left him with the uncomfortable conclusion that the killer was someone he hadn't seriously considered. Someone who'd been helpful and kind and entirely above suspicion. Someone like Morag Ross. The next morning, Hamish returned to the archives, this time with official permission from the council to review historical records. He spent hours poring over property deeds, birth certificates and marriage records, piecing together the Ross family history. Robert Ross had been a proud man, by all accounts, a skilled engineer who'd built a thriving business through hard work and integrity. The bankruptcy that destroyed him had been swift and brutal, engineered by Victor Vane through a combination of predatory pricing and what the court records delicately termed accounting irregularities. But the court had ruled in Vane's favour, and Ross and MacLeod had folded. 3 months later, Robert Ross was found dead in his car, a hosepipe running from the exhaust. The inquest had returned a verdict of suicide while the balance of mind was disturbed. His widow, Margaret Ross, had left Lochdoub shortly afterward with their daughter. The girl's name was listed as Morag Catherine Ross, aged 8. Hamish sat back, the pieces falling into place with an almost audible click. Morag Ross hadn't just known about the items buried beneath the churchyard wall. They were her family's possessions, hidden by her father before his death. And Julian Vane, son of the man who destroyed her family, had discovered the secret and used it as leverage. But why had she stayed in Lochdoub all these years? Why return to the place where her family had suffered such tragedy? The answer came to him with sudden clarity. She hadn't returned. She'd never truly left. Morag had stayed, changing her name slightly perhaps, or simply letting people assume she was a different Morag entirely. She'd become part of the village fabric, patient and quiet, waiting for the day when she could reclaim what her father had hidden. And then Julian Vane had appeared, threatening to expose everything. Hamish's mobile rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jimmy Anderson, sounding worried. "Hamish, we've got a problem. Archie's alibi checks out. The pub owner confirms he was in the cellar all night. Blair's having to release him." "That's good news." "Surely." It would be if Blair wasn't determined to find someone else to arrest immediately. He's convinced the killer is still in Lochdoub, and he's threatening to bring in everyone who had contact with Vane for intensive questioning, including your friend Mrs. Ross. Hamish felt his stomach tighten. When? Tomorrow morning. He's having her brought to Strathbane for a formal interview. After he rang off, Hamish sat for a long time staring at the historical record spread before him. He had enough now to build a theory, perhaps even enough to convince Jimmy. But Blair would never listen to circumstantial evidence and historical grievances. He needed something concrete, something that would prove Morag had been at the churchyard that night. He thought about the archival glue on Vane's jacket, about the precision of the killing blow, about someone who knew the library so well they could retrieve a weapon in the dark without hesitation. And he thought about what Morag had said when he had surprised her at the library that morning. Everything looked perfectly normal when I opened up the day after it happened. Not the day after Vane died, the day after it happened. As if she'd been thinking of the murder as an event she'd participated in, not merely heard about. It was a small slip, perhaps meaningless. But Hamish had learned over the years that small slips were often the threads that unravelled entire tapestries of lies. He gathered up the historical documents and headed back to the police station. Tonight he would review everything he knew. Tomorrow, before Blair could haul Morag off to Strathbane, Hamish would need to make a decision. Did he have enough evidence to accuse a woman who'd lived in Loch Dubh for decades, who'd served tea to the entire village, who'd never raised her voice or shown a moment's anger? And if he did accuse her, would he be serving justice or simply helping Blair close a case that deserved more careful consideration? Outside his window, the Highland night was falling, dark and deep. In the distance he could see the lights of the village, warm and welcoming against the cold. Tomorrow one of those lights would go dark, and the delicate equilibrium of Loch Dubh would be shattered once again. Hamish fed his animals and made himself a cup of tea. Then he settled in to work through the night, because that was what a good constable did, even a lazy one who'd rather be sleeping. Especially when an innocent woman's freedom hung in the balance, or perhaps a guilty one's. That, he supposed, was what he needed to determine. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Hamish spent the early morning hours methodically working through his suspect list, checking and rechecking alibis with the thoroughness of a man who knew that Blair's incompetence could ruin innocent lives. By the time the sun rose over the loch, painting the water gold and pink, he had confirmed what he'd already suspected. Every obvious suspect had an alibi solid as Highland granite. Archie McLean had been sleeping off his whiskey in the pub cellar from 9 o'clock until 7 the following morning. The bartender, 2 regulars, and the pub owner's wife had all confirmed it. Hamish had even checked the cellar himself, and found the makeshift bed Archie used, complete with an empty whiskey bottle dated the night of the murder. Callum Vane's alibi was equally unshakable. The traffic cameras on the A9 showed his car heading south at 8 o'clock on the evening of the murder, and the staff at the Balmoral Hotel in Edinburgh confirmed he'd arrived at 10:30, made a scene about the kitchen closing, and been seen by multiple witnesses until well past midnight. Unless he could teleport, he was in the clear. Dr. Brodie had been playing poker with Reverend Wellington from 7 until midnight, with Mrs. Wellington providing corroboration and a disapproving account of the sums that had changed hands. The Reverend had shown Hamish his diary, which recorded not only the poker games but also the doctor's losses, noted with what Hamish suspected was mild schadenfreude, which left the puzzle of how the murder had actually been accomplished. Hamish spread out the crime scene photographs on his kitchen table, ignoring Sonsi's attempts to lie on them. The killer had approached Vane from behind in near-total darkness, navigated to the library without being seen, retrieved a specific weapon from a locked display case, returned to the churchyard, and delivered a single, precise, killing blow. That required intimate knowledge of the village geography, access to the library, and the kind of calm calculation that suggested long planning rather than a crime of passion. He was still studying the photographs when his mobile rang. It was Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, her gentle voice tight with anxiety. "Hamish, I hope you don't mind my calling, but I've just remembered something that might be important. About the night poor Mr. Vane died." "Go on, Mrs. Brodie." "Well, I was taking my evening walk around the village, as I always do after dinner. I suffer from insomnia, you see, and the fresh air helps. I passed the library at about 9:30, and I could have sworn I saw a light moving inside. Just a brief flash, like someone with a torch." "Did you see who it was?" "No, I'm afraid not. I assumed it was Mrs. Ross working late on some cataloguing project. She's terribly dedicated, you know. But then I thought, if someone had broken in to steal that peat cutter—" "What time did you say this was?" 9:30. I'm quite certain because the church bells had just finished striking the half-hour." Hamish thanked her and rang off, his mind working rapidly. 9:30. That put someone in the library an hour and a half before the estimated time of death, plenty of time to retrieve the murder weapon and make their way to the churchyard. And he needed to establish Morag Ross's movements that evening with certainty. The trouble was, she lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of the village, with no close neighbours to observe her comings and goings. But Lockdoob was a small place, and someone had surely seen her. He started with the Curry sisters, who could be relied upon to have noticed anything unusual. They received him in their parlour with the ceremonial serving of tea, and an avalanche of gossip about Blair's incompetence. "Such a dreadful man," said Nessie, pursing her lips. "Arrested poor Archie without a shred of real evidence." "Without a shred," echoed Jessie. "I'm actually here to ask about Mrs. Ross," said Hamish. "Did either of you see her the evening Mr. Vane was killed?" The sisters exchanged glances. "Now that you mention it," said Nessie slowly. "We did see her walking toward the church around 9 o'clock. We remarked on it at the time, didn't we, Jessie? Unusual for her to be out so late." "So late," agreed Jessie. "She was carrying her library bag, the big canvas one she uses for transporting books." "And did you see her return?" Nessie frowned. "Can't say we did. We went to bed at 10, as we always do. Regular habits keep one healthy, Constable." "Regular habits," Jessie confirmed. So Morag had been out at 9 o'clock, heading toward the church with a large bag. Hamish felt the case beginning to solidify, but he needed more. He needed to eliminate any possibility that she had returned home before the murder. His next stop was the village shop, where the owner, Mr. Patel, was arranging newspapers for the morning delivery. "Constable Macbeth!" "Ah, terrible business about the murder. My wife is quite distraught. She says we should install security cameras." "Actually, Mr. Patel, that's rather what I wanted to ask you about. I don't suppose you have any security cameras?" "Only the one, pointing at the till. For insurance purposes, you understand. But it does catch the front of the shop and part of the street." Hamish's pulse quickened. "Would you still have the footage from the night of the murder?" "Oh yes. The system keeps everything for 2 weeks before recording over it." 20 minutes later, Hamish was watching grainy black and white footage on Mr. Patel's computer screen. The angles showed the shop front and a slice of the main street, including the path that led to both the library and the churchyard. At 9:14, a familiar figure appeared, walking briskly toward the church. Even in the poor quality footage, Hamish recognised Morag Ross's characteristic gait, the way she held her bag close to her body. She was alone and moving with purpose. "Can you fast forward to see when she comes back?" asked Hamish. They watched the footage speed through the evening hours. A few villagers passed by, heading home from the pub. A cat crossed the street. But Morag Ross did not reappear until 11:47, walking in the opposite direction back toward her cottage. She no longer carried the large bag, and her pace was slower, almost careful. Nearly 3 hours unaccounted for, thought Hamish. More than enough time to kill Julian Vane, clean the murder weapon, and return it to the library before going home. But it still wasn't proof. She could argue she'd been at the church for evening prayers, or visiting someone, or taking a long walk. Without a witness who'd actually seen her at the churchyard at the time of death, it remained circumstantial. He thanked Mr. Patel and stepped outside, nearly colliding with Jimmy Anderson, who looked as if he'd been up all night. "Hamish, thank God. Blair's on the warpath, Archie's alibi is held up, and he's looking for someone else to arrest. He's got Mrs. Ross coming in for questioning this afternoon." "On what grounds?" "He's found out she had keys to the library display case. Says that gives her means and opportunity, and he's determined to find a motive." Jimmy lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I think he's right to look at her. But Blair being right is usually an accident, and he's going to bungle this if we're not careful. What's he planning?" "Full interrogation. His Strathbane interview room, the works. He wants to intimidate her into a confession." Jimmy shook his head. "Problem is, if she's innocent, he'll traumatise a harmless librarian, and if she's guilty, she's clever enough to run rings around him." Hamish thought of Morag's gentle demeanour, her helpful suggestions, the way she'd steered Blair toward other suspects with her carefully compiled list. If she was the killer, she'd been playing a long game with considerable skill. Jimmy, I need you to do something for me. Delay that interview as long as you can. Tell Blair I've found new evidence that needs to be processed first. Have you? I have. But I need to confront Mrs. Ross myself quietly before Blair gets his hands on her. If she's innocent, I'll clear her. And if she's guilty... He paused. Well, I'd rather she confessed to someone who understands what drove her to it. Jimmy studied him for a long moment. You think she did it? I think she had better reason than anyone else, and I think if we don't handle this carefully, the truth will get buried under Blair's incompetence and the village will never heal from it. All right, I'll stall him until this evening, but Hamish, if you're wrong about this, then I'll take whatever's coming to me, but I need to try. After Jimmy left, Hamish stood in the brightening morning, watching the village come to life around him. Shopkeepers opening their doors, children heading to school, fishermen returning with their morning catch. The ordinary rhythm of Loch Dhu, undisturbed and eternal, except that tonight that rhythm would be broken, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. He had one day to uncover the truth, one day to find the final piece of evidence that would prove Morag Ross had murdered Julian Vane, or to discover that he was wrong and the real killer was still out there, watching and waiting. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Flaw. Hamish spent the morning going over Morag's helpful timeline with the meticulous attention of a jeweller examining a diamond for flaws. And like a diamond under scrutiny, the flaws were there once you knew where to look. The list she'd provided to Blair had been impressively detailed, noting who Vane had threatened and when. But there was an entry that nagged at Hamish's mind. 8:15 p.m. Vane Consulting volume of Highland Property Deeds, 1955 to 1960, in library archives. The problem was that particular volume had been destroyed in a fire in 1982. Hamish knew this because he'd spent 2 hours that morning on the telephone with the Highland Council archives, confirming which historical documents had been lost over the years. The librarian in Inverness had been quite certain. The 1955 to 1960 property deed volume had gone up in flames along with half the council's historical records when a storage facility caught fire. Morag Ross, as village librarian and local history volunteer, would have known this. She would have been intimately familiar with which records existed and which didn't. So why would she place Vane consulting a non-existent volume, unless she was manufacturing evidence to support her story? The second flaw was smaller but equally telling. That morning, when he had stopped by the library on the pretence of returning a book, she'd casually mentioned that she hoped poor Archie's ordeal would be over soon. But Hamish hadn't told her about Archie's release. Blair certainly hadn't announced it publicly. The information had come through Jimmy less than 2 hours ago, unless Morag had another source of information, or unless she was so confident in her manipulation of events that she already knew Archie's alibi would hold. The third flaw arrived in his hands at noon, delivered by the afternoon post. It was a note, unsigned, on cheap-lined paper that looked like it had been torn from a school notebook. The handwriting was crude, the spelling deliberately poor. Archie McLean is a violent man when he drinks. He threatened to kill Vane. Check his shed for proof. The paper was wrong. The handwriting was wrong. But most tellingly, the timing was wrong. This note had been postmarked 2 days after the murder, carefully calculated to arrive just as Archie's arrest was falling apart. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. And it reeked of desperation. Hamish held the note up to the window, examining it in the light. The paper was ordinary enough, but there was something about the ink. He pulled out his magnifying glass and studied the writing more closely. The pen had made small impressions in the paper, and in several places the ink had that distinctive dark richness that came from a fountain pen, not the cheap ballpoint the crude handwriting suggested. He photographed the note and sent it to Jimmy with a brief message. Check this against any writing samples you can get from MR. Look for fountain pen ink and paper fibres. Then he set out for the Heritage Centre, a small building next to the library where Morag oversaw displays of local history. If he was right about her identity, about her connection to the Ross family tragedy, There might be something there that proved it. The Heritage Centre smelled of a lavender and old paper, a comforting scent that Morag maintained through bowls of potpourri placed strategically around the room. The displays were lovingly curated, photographs of Loch Dubh through the decades, farming implements, a recreated crofter's kitchen, and a section dedicated to local businesses that had shaped the village's history. It was this last section that drew Hamish's attention. Among the photographs of fishing boats and wool merchants was a small display about Ross and McLeod engineering. The text was brief, mentioning only that the firm had operated in Loch Dubh from 1948 to 1958, specialising in agricultural machinery repair. There was a photograph of the two partners standing in front of their workshop, Robert Ross and Donald MacLeod, and both young men with the confident smiles of those who believed hard work would be rewarded. But it was the photograph beside it that made Hamish's breath catch. It showed a company picnic, workers and their families gathered on the shore of the loch. In the foreground, a little girl in a summer dress was feeding ducks, her face turned toward the camera with an expression of pure joy. Hamish pulled out his mobile and photographed the image, then zoomed in on the girl's face. The resemblance to the present-day Morag Ross was unmistakable once you looked for it. The same round face, the same bright eyes, the same way she tilted her head slightly to the left. The caption read, "Company Picnic, July 1957. Young Morag Ross feeds the ducks." She'd hidden in plain sight, he realised. Put her own childhood photograph on display, unconfident that no one would make the connection between an 8-year-old girl and the middle-aged woman who organised the exhibits. His mobile buzzed. It was a text from Jimmy. "Forensics preliminary on your note. Fountain pen ink, probable Waterman brand. Paper has trace amounts of archival preservation chemicals. Same stuff used in library conservation work." Hamish felt the last pieces fall into place. Morag had written the note herself, trying to shore up the case against Archie when she realised his alibi was going to hold. But she'd made a mistake, using her own fountain pen and paper from the library stock. He was examining a display case containing old business ledgers when he heard the door open behind him. He turned to find Morag Ross herself standing in the doorway, holding a plate covered with a tea towel. "Constable Macbeth," she said, her smile warm and welcoming. "I thought you might be here. I've brought you some shortbread, fresh from the oven. You look so tired this morning. I thought you could use something sweet." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Ross." She set the plate on a small table and poured tea from a thermos she had brought. "I find the Heritage Centre so peaceful, don't you? All these memories of better times, before terrible things like murder disturbed our quiet village." Hamish accepted a cup of tea and a piece of shortbread, watching her carefully. She seemed entirely at ease, moving about the room with the confidence of someone on home ground. "I was just admiring your display about Ross and MacLeod engineering," he said. "Tragic story, the way the business failed." "Oh yes, terribly tragic. Before my time. Of course, but I've researched the local history quite thoroughly." She gestured to the photographs. "The bankruptcy ruined several families. Robert Ross took his own life, you know. His poor wife and daughter had to leave Loch Dubh in disgrace." "You seem to know quite a bit about the Ross family." "Well, it's part of the village history. One must preserve these stories, even the sad ones, mustn't one?" She moved to the window, looking out at the village. "I heard they've released poor Archie McLean. Such a relief. I never believed he could have done something so violent. How did you hear about his release, Mrs. Ross? It's not been officially announced." There was the briefest hesitation, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. "Oh, you know how word travels in a small village, Constable. Someone must have mentioned it at the shop. The shop's been closed all morning. Mr. Patel had to drive to Strathbane for supplies." Morag turned from the window, and for just a moment Hamish saw something flicker across her gentle features. Something cold and calculating that vanished almost before he could register it. "Then perhaps I heard it from someone at the hotel. Really, Constable, I can't recall every conversation. My memory isn't what it used to be." Strange, though, said Hamish, pulling out the photograph he'd taken of the young girl feeding ducks. Because your memory seems quite sharp when it comes to local history. Sharp enough to curate this entire centre. Sharp enough to remember which documents exist in the archives and which ones were destroyed in the fire of 1982. He showed her the photograph. This is you. Isn't it? Morag Ross, daughter of Robert Ross, the man who killed himself after Victor Vane destroyed his business. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Morag stared at the photograph, her face very still. Then, slowly she smiled. But it wasn't the sweet, gentle smile of the village librarian. It was something else entirely, sharp-edged, and utterly without warmth. "Oh, Hamish," she said softly. "You really are much cleverer than you pretend to be, aren't you? Chapter 9, Sins of the Past." Morag moved away from the window and settled herself in a chair with the composure of a woman attending a garden party, rather than facing a murder accusation. She smoothed her skirt and folded her hands in her lap, the picture of genteel respectability. "I suppose you'll want the whole story," she said calmly. "Would you like more tea first? I find confessions go better with refreshment." "Mrs. Ross? Just Morag, please. Or should I say Miss Ross? I never married, you see. Never saw the point after everything was taken from us." She poured herself a cup of tea with steady hands. "Do sit down, Hamish. You're looming rather, and it's making me nervous." Hamish sat, his notebook out but his pencil still. Something told him this was a confession that needed to be heard before it was recorded. "I was 8 years old when Victor Vane destroyed my father," Morag began, her voice matter-of-fact. "Too young to understand the complexities of business fraud, but old enough to see what it did to Papa. He aged 10 years in 3 months, stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped being the man who taught me to feed the ducks, and told me bedtime stories about Highland fairies." She took a sip of tea, her eyes distant with memory. "The night before he died, he took me to the churchyard. It was late, past my bedtime, and Mamma was already in bed with one of her headaches. Papa had a small chest with him, one I'd never seen before. Inside were things from his grandfather's estate, a silver pocket watch, some old coins, a set of mourning jewellery with locks of hair from long-dead relatives. Nothing of enormous value, easy but precious because they were ours, the last tangible connection to our family history." "He hid them beneath the churchyard wall," said Hamish quietly. "Yes. He pried up some of the stones at the base, tucked the chest deep into the foundation, and replaced everything carefully. He made me promise never to tell anyone, not even Mama. Said the creditors would take them if they knew, and he couldn't bear to lose everything." Her voice caught slightly. "The next day, he drove his car into the garage, closed the door, and started the engine. The milkman found him that afternoon." Hamish let the silence stretch, understanding that some stories needed space to breathe. "Mamma took me away 3 days after the funeral. We went to live with her sister in Inverness. Changed my surname to hers, Mackenzie. Yeah, so I wouldn't have to carry the stigma of the Ross bankruptcy. I grew up, went to library school, got a job in Aberdeen." She smiled without humour. "I was good at my work, quiet and efficient. Nobody noticed me much, which suited me perfectly." "But you came back to Lockdube 15 years ago. When the position of village librarian came open, I applied under my mother's maiden name, Morag Mackenzie. Nobody made the connection to the little girl who'd left decades earlier. Why would they? I was just another middle-aged spinster librarian, harmless and helpful." The bitterness in her voice was like acid beneath honey. "I changed it back to Ross later, gradually, letting people think I'd married and divorced. Nobody questioned it. Why come back at all? Because this was my home, Hamish. Because my father's blood is in this soil. And because I'd promised myself that one day I'd reclaim what was ours. I waited patiently, biding my time, being useful to everyone, making myself indispensable. And then," her jaw tightened, "then Julian Bloody Vane arrived. He found out who you were. Oh, he was clever about it. spent days in the archives, cross-referencing property records with old newspaper accounts of the bankruptcy. He worked out that the little Morag Ross in the historical photographs and the helpful Mrs. Ross who ran the Heritage Centre were the same person. And then he found my father's journal. His journal? Papa kept meticulous records. I donated them to the archives years ago, thinking they were safe, that nobody would bother reading the business notes of a failed engineer from 60 years past. But Vane read every word, and in the final entry, written the night before he died, Papa mentioned hiding the family treasures beneath the churchyard wall. She stood and walked to the window again, her back to Hamish. Vane came to me 3 days before he died. So pleased with himself, so smug. He told me he knew who I was, knew about the hidden items, said he'd already started digging at the wall but hadn't found them yet, wanted me to show him exactly where they were. And if he didn't, he'd expose everything, tell the whole village I was Robert Ross's daughter, living under false pretences, claim I'd stolen historical artefacts that rightfully belonged to the creditor's estate. He'd already consulted a lawyer, you see. Even after all these years, there was legal ambiguity about whether those items could be considered part of the bankruptcy settlement. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He was going to take the last pieces of my father from me, just like his father had taken everything else. So you killed him. She turned and her face was serene, almost peaceful. I went to the library that evening and took the peat cutter from the display. I'd had a duplicate key made weeks earlier, you see, after Vane first started snooping about. I knew he might try to access things he shouldn't, so I wanted to be able to check the displays after hours. Lucky, really, that I had it. You'd been planning this. Planning to protect myself, yes. I didn't decide to kill him until that afternoon. When he came to the library laughing about how he'd beaten me just like his father had beaten mine, said it was in the Vane blood to win and in the Ross blood to lose. Her hands clenched into fists, the first sign of real emotion breaking through her calm facade. I told him I'd show him where the items were buried, asked him to meet me at the churchyard at 10 o'clock, when the village would be settled in for the night. He was so arrogant he never suspected danger from a harmless old librarian. You approached him from behind while he was digging. It was surprisingly easy. One clean blow and he dropped without a sound. I'd worried about the mess, the noise, but it was all very tidy. She said the word as if describing a successful filing system. I cleaned the peat cutter with rags I'd brought, returned it to the library, and went home. Changed my clothes, burned them in my fireplace. By morning, I was making scones for the village, the same helpful Morag Ross I'd always been. Hamish felt a chill run down his spine. The calculation in her voice was more disturbing than any rage would have been. And the helpful suggestions to Blair, the list of suspects. Misdirection, pure and simple. I knew Blair was incompetent, knew he'd chase after the obvious targets. I just helped him along. She smiled, and there was genuine amusement in it. Though I must admit, your friend Jimmy Anderson worried me. He's smarter than Blair by a considerable margin. I was beginning to think I might have to adjust my plans. By framing Archie more thoroughly. The note was a mistake, I see that now. Too rushed, too desperate. I should have trusted that Blair's incompetence would carry the day. She studied Hamish with the same bright interest she might show a curious historical artefact. But you worked it all out anyway, didn't you? The lazy constable who never met an ambition he didn't avoid. You're quite the dark horse, Hamish Macbeth. I'm just doing my job. Your job is to arrest me now, I suppose. She sat down again and finished her tea with perfect composure. Will you call Blair, or will you handle it yourself? I'd prefer it wasn't Blair, if I'm being honest. The man's such a dreadful bore. Hamish looked at her, this woman who'd lived with patient hatred for decades, who'd baked scones and organised heritage displays while waiting for her chance at revenge. Part of him understood the impulse, even sympathised with the tragedy that had driven her to it. But understanding didn't change what she'd done. I'll call Jimmy Anderson, he said quietly. He'll treat you fairly. Thank you, Hamish. That's kind of you. She paused. For what it's worth, I'm not sorry I killed Julian Vane. He was a monster, just like his father. The world is better without him. Perhaps. But that wasn't your decision to make, wasn't it? Who else was going to stop him? The law? The same law that let his father destroy mine? She shook her head. Sometimes justice requires us to take matters into our own hands. That's not justice, Morag. That's vengeance. Is there really a difference, Constable? Or is that just what we tell ourselves to sleep better at night? Hamish had no answer for that. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. Jimmy Anderson arrived within the hour, bringing with him a female constable and the sombre efficiency of someone who understood that this arrest would hurt the village in ways Blair's blundering never could. Morag submitted to the handcuffs with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the confession, pausing only to ask if someone might water the plants in the Heritage Centre while she was away. "I'll see to it myself, Mrs. Ross," said Hamish, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. "You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth. Too good for this job, I suspect, though you'd never admit it." After they'd taken her away, Hamish sat alone in the Heritage Centre for a long while, and was surrounded by the carefully curated memories of a village that had no idea how close it had come to tearing itself apart. He thought about Robert Ross and his hidden treasures, about fathers and daughters and the weight of old sins, about the fine line between justice and revenge. Then he pulled out his mobile and made a call. "Blair, it's Macbeth. I've got something you'll want to see." The Detective Chief Inspector arrived in a flurry of self-importance, his small eyes gleaming with suspicious interest. "This had better be good, Macbeth. I've just been informed that Anderson has arrested Mrs. Ross for the murder, and I'll not have you trying to take credit for my investigation." "Wouldn't dream of it, sir," said Hamish blandly, "but I thought you should know I found this in Mrs. Ross's desk drawer." He handed over a clear evidence bag containing the forged threatening note and a fountain pen that forensics would undoubtedly match to the ink. Beside it was the ledger from the library safe, which Hamish had retrieved that afternoon with a proper warrant. Blair's eyes lit up. Evidence! Solid, physical evidence linking her to the crime. Excellent work, Macbeth. Though I must say, you should have brought this to me immediately rather than going behind my back to Anderson. "Actually, sir, I found most of this earlier, but didn't recognise its significance until you'd already released Archie MacLean. Your decision to verify his alibi so thoroughly was what made me realise we needed to look elsewhere." The lie came easily, lubricated by years of practice at managing Blair's ego. "I simply followed the trail you'd established." "Did you indeed?" Blair puffed up like a roosting pigeon. "Well, of course. The groundwork is always the key to these cases. Anderson may have made the actual arrest, but it was my investigation that cracked it. All comes down to proper detective work, Macbeth. The sort of thing you'd understand if you weren't so content to remain a village constable. Yes, sir, I'm sure the papers will want to hear all about your brilliant deduction." "Undoubtedly. I'll need to prepare a statement for the press." Blair gathered up the evidence bags with possessive care. "You'll back up my account, won't you, Macbeth? Tell them how my leadership directed the investigation?" "Wouldn't have it any other way, sir." After Blair departed to bask in his unearned glory, and Hamish walked slowly back through the village, dusk was settling over Lochdew, painting the loch in shades of purple and gold. Lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering dark. The village looked peaceful, undisturbed, as if murder had never touched it. But Hamish knew better. The scars would remain, hidden beneath the surface like Robert Ross's treasures beneath the churchyard wall, waiting to be uncovered by time and chance. He found Jimmy Anderson at the hotel bar, nursing a whiskey and looking thoroughly depressed. "She confessed the whole thing," Jimmy said as Hamish slid onto the stool beside him. "Calm as you please, like she was reading from a shopping list. The fiscal's convinced she'll plead guilty, save everyone the trauma of a trial. How long will she get? Life? Probably, but with mitigating circumstances. Provocation. Years of emotional trauma. She'll likely serve 15 years, maybe less if her lawyers are good. He took a drink. Blair's already claiming credit for the whole investigation, I suppose. Let him. It makes everyone's life easier. Does it, though? Jimmy turned to look at him. You solved this case, Hamish. You tracked down every lead, eliminated every suspect, found the evidence that proved her guilt, and Blair's going to get a commendation while you remain stuck in Loughdoob. That's the point, Jimmy. I want to be stuck in Loughdoob. You're a better detective than anyone in Strathbane, including me. Don't you ever want recognition for that? Hamish considered his answer carefully. What I want is to feed my sheep in the morning. Have a cup of tea without someone demanding I fill out forms in triplicate, and go to sleep at night knowing that my village is safe. Blair can have the medals and the headlines. I'll keep the peace and quiet. Jimmy shook his head in amused resignation. You're either the wisest man I know or the most stubborn. I haven't worked out which yet. Can't it be both? They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the locals drift in for their evening pints. Archie McLean was there, looking considerably more cheerful now that he'd been cleared of murder and reunited with his hidden whiskey fund, which his wife had magnanimously agreed he could keep in exchange for his doing the washing up for 6 months. Dr. Brodie sat in a corner, reading a medical journal and occasionally glancing guiltily toward the door, as if expecting the salmon police to burst in at any moment. What about the items buried beneath the wall? Asked Jimmy. Did she ever retrieve them? No, she said she couldn't bring herself to dig them up, not after what happened there. Said they could stay buried with her father's memory. Hamish paused. I'm going to leave them there. Seems fitting somehow. A family's treasures resting in consecrated ground. Blair won't like it if he finds out. Blair won't find out because I'm not going to tell him, and neither are you. Jimmy raised his glass in a small salute. To the lazy constable of Loughdoob, who sees more than he lets on and shares less than he knows. I'll drink to that, said Hamish, and they clinked glasses in the warm, smoky atmosphere of the hotel bar. Later, as he walked home through the quiet streets, Hamish thought about Morag Ross sitting in a cell in Strathbane, probably still calm, still composed, still certain that what she'd done was justified. He wondered if she would feel differently after a few years in prison, or if her conviction would remain unshaken until the end. Some questions, he supposed, didn't have answers. At home he found Lugs and Sonsy waiting for him with the patient expectation of animals who knew their dinner was overdue. He fed them both, made himself a cheese sandwich and settled into his favourite chair with a cup of tea and the last of Morag's shortbread. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even now, after everything, her scones and shortbread would be remembered fondly by the village. People would say what a shame it was, how nobody had suspected, how she'd seemed so kind. In time, the memory of her gentleness would overshadow the memory of her crime, and Loughdoob would return to its comfortable rhythms. That was the way of small villages. They absorbed their tragedies and carried on, because what else could they do? His telephone rang and he answered it to find the voice of his superior, Superintendent Davia, congratulating him on his supporting role in such a complex investigation. Detective Chief Inspector Blair speaks very highly of your cooperation, Macbeth. Says you followed orders admirably and didn't try to overstep your position. Just doing my job, sir. Quite. Well, given your satisfactory performance, I'm pleased to inform you that we won't be pursuing that transfer to Strathbane we discussed last month. You're clearly well suited to village police work. We need solid, reliable constables who know their limitations. Thank you, sir. That's very gratifying to hear. After he rang off, Hamish leaned back in his chair and smiled. Solid and reliable, knew his limitations, perfectly content to remain in obscurity while others took the glory. It was exactly the reputation he'd worked so hard to cultivate. Outside, the night settled over Loughdoob like a comfortable blanket. The loch lapped gently at the shore, the sheep drowsed in their fold, and the village slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their lazy constable was watching over them. Lug snored softly by the fire, Sonsy purred in her chair, and Hamish Macbeth, the man who'd solved a murder while making it look like he'd done nothing at all, finished his tea and permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. Tomorrow there would be forms to fill out, statements to take, and the endless bureaucracy that followed any serious crime. Blair would hold his press conference, Jimmy would do the actual work, and Hamish would fade quietly back into the comfortable obscurity of village life. But tonight, he had his animals, his warm kitchen, and the peace that came from knowing justice had been served, even if it wore an uncomfortable face. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything he had ever wanted. And somewhere in Strathbane, in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair, Morag Ross sat with her memories and her certainties, and wondered if revenge had been worth the price after all. But that, thought Hamish, was a question she would have to answer for herself. He reached down to scratch lugs behind his ridiculous ears. And the dog thumped his tail in contentment. In Lochdu all was well, and that was exactly how Hamish Macbeth intended to keep it.